So let's talk about fat again today. So there is a type of fat that you cannot pinch, you cannot see, and you cannot measure on your normal bathroom scale. And it's one of the most dangerous things happening inside billions of people across the world right now. It is not the fat under your skin. It is the fat that is packed deep inside your abdomen. It's wrapped around all of your organs inside this big cavity here. And the scary thing about this type of fat is that you can accumulate really dangerous levels of it long before you look obviously overweight, long before a doctor flags anything on a standard blood test, and long before you feel any sort of symptoms. So let me give you some numbers first of all. So visceral fat, which is the type of fat we're talking about here, is independently associated with a 2 to 3 times increased risk of cardiovascular disease, even after adjusting for body weight and BMI. And we know how useless BMI is. A study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that people with high visceral fat but a normal BMI had a significantly worse cardiovascular risk profiles than people with high BMI but lower visceral fat. So in other words, the number on the scales is a really poor guide to what's actually happening inside your body. And if you've watched these videos in the past, we know that your weight alone is a pretty poor marker. Now, another large meta-analysis found that excess amounts of this deep abdominal fat was associated with a 44% increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes independently of overall obesity, meaning across all body sizes, not just in people who are obviously overweight. Now, making changes to your sleep and your movement and what you eat is obviously one of the most effective things that you can do to reduce this type of fat specifically. And visceral fat actually is one of the first types of tissue, types of fat that the body loses when you improve these things consistently. And so obviously that is good news. If you start changing your lifestyle, your visceral fat will start reducing first. And what I want to do in this video is explain why, explain the science behind why that happens. If you're new here, then hello, welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Alex. I've spent a decade in emergency medicine, which means I've seen the end stages of the things that kill us. So we're talking about heart disease and strokes and liver failure and type 2 diabetes and cancer and dementia, all of these things. And visceral fat actually has a big part to play in all of those conditions. So understanding what visceral fat is and why it behaves the way it does, I think, to be honest, is one of the most important pieces of health education that most people never receive. When was the last time your doctor spoke to you about visceral fat? Probably never, but this is something that's getting a lot more traction these days, a lot more attention, so clearly that is a good thing. So let's see if we can shed some more light on this subject in this video. So what actually is visceral fat, and why does it matter so much more than other types of fat, like the stuff under your skin? So most people think of fat as just one thing, the stuff that accumulates when you eat too much food or you move too little. But fat isn't just one thing, just like muscle isn't just one thing. So think about chicken for a moment, bear with me. So in a chicken, you've got white meat and brown meat. It's the same animal, it's the same basic tissue, but they have completely different structures and compositions and functions. So body fat works in a similar way. There are fundamentally different types. A bit like with muscle, you've got fast twitch muscle fibers and slow twitch muscle fibers as well. You've got different types of fat stored in different places, behaving in completely different ways biologically. And that distinction is really important. It really matters for your health. So the fat that you can pinch under your skin, on your arms or your thighs or your waist is called subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous basically means under the skin. Under, cutaneous meaning skin. Now this fat is relatively inert. What we mean, it doesn't really do anything. It just sits there primarily as an energy store. And while very large amounts of it can carry their own risks, it is broadly sort of passive in moderate quantities. The average person with the average amount of subcutaneous fat, it doesn't really do much. What does happen though is that subcutaneous fat is broken down to generate fuel and energy, but it's not usually the first one to be broken down. So when glucose runs out and then your glycogen stores are depleted because we burn glucose first and then glycogen, the body then shifts to burning fat for energy. And something that's really interesting is that visceral fat, because of its high metabolic activity and how close it is to the bloodstream, it's actually mobilized more readily than the subcutaneous fat under your skin during periods of calorie deficits or exercise or fasting or whatever. Subcutaneous fat tends to be the more stubborn long-term store. And this is one of the really encouraging things about addressing visceral fat. It's the most harmful for us, but it's also the first one to go when you change your lifestyle because the body can access it relatively easily. Now, visceral fat, by contrast, is stored deep inside your abdominal cavity. It's packed around and in between your organs like the liver and your intestines and the kidneys, at the back as well, the pancreas. Visceral basically means relating to the internal organs. Your viscera are the organs inside. You cannot feel this fat from the outside. Now, somebody can have a relatively flat stomach and still carry dangerous levels of this type of fat. Somebody can be only slightly overweight by any external measure and have their liver almost entirely surrounded by it. And unlike the sort of superficial fat under your skin doing relatively little, visceral fat is active, it's biologically active. It behaves less like passive storage and more like a rogue organ, an organ that is doing some pretty nasty things. It is continuously releasing hormones and fatty acids and inflammatory signals into the bloodstream 24/7. And that distinction between fat that stores and fat that acts and does something, that is what makes visceral fat so clinically significant. And it is what the rest of this video is about. So what would you actually see during surgery or at a post-mortem in somebody who had a large amount of visceral fat? Well, as somebody who's seen this, it is pretty striking stuff. Instead of the clean anatomical planes and sort of surfaces that you normally see between the organs, everything is buried in this thick yellow-white fat. Now, the omentum, which is almost like a large apron of tissue that hangs from the stomach over the intestines, this is really heavy and absolutely swollen with fat. The liver, which should be almost like a smooth, deep reddish brown, is pale and enlarged, and it's got almost like a greasy, almost waxy appearance when it's sort of accumulated a lot of fat inside its own cells. And it's a condition that we call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The loops of the intestines are really difficult to identify individually because fat is packed between them literally. It looks, quite frankly, like everything has been encased in lard, like somebody has put a hole in your abdominal wall and pumped a load of fat inside that cavity. And it makes surgery really difficult. It's one of those things that you see in a theatre that stays with you. You can't really forget this sort of stuff. So the big question really is, how would somebody know whether they have a significant amount of visceral fat if you can't see it, or if you can't measure it or even feel it from the outside? Well, the most accessible tool is something called the waist to height ratio. You simply measure your waist circumference at the level of your belly button and then divide that number by your height. And you need to measure both of those in the same units. It doesn't really matter whether it's millimeters or meters or inches or whatever. Now, a ratio below 0.5 is generally considered healthy. Above 0.5 suggests that you've got an increasing amount of visceral fat, and what that means is that your metabolic risk is going up as well. So if you are 180 centimeters tall, then a waist circumference below 90 centimeters puts you below 0.5. And this is a much, much better guide than BMI alone, because as we know, BMI is crap. It specifically captures central abdominal fat rather than overall body mass, which is what BMI does. But the waist to height ratio is even more useful when you combine it with what you know about your lifestyle. So think of it as a two-part assessment. If your ratio is very comfortably below 0.5 and your sleep is good, you're eating really well, you're exercising regularly, and your stress levels are manageable, then the picture is very reassuring, obviously. But if your ratio is borderline or above 0.5, and alongside that, you are sleeping poorly, you're not moving much, you're pretty sedentary, you work in an office and you sit on your bum all day, and you're commuting 2 hours a day, you don't really eat that well, you eat mostly ultra-processed stuff. Well, each of those factors individually promotes visceral fat accumulation, and I'll explain why later in the video. And together with your ratio and your lifestyle, that sort of context together gives you a much clearer picture than either one alone. So in that last example, really, the chances are that you've got quite a lot of visceral fat. Okay, what does high versus low visceral fat actually look like in two real people? What does it look like in practice? How can somebody have a high BMI but low visceral fat? And then how can the reverse be true? So how can somebody have a low BMI and high visceral fat? So think of a competitive rugby player or a weightlifter. They might weigh 110 kilos and have a BMI that technically classifies them as obese. But the majority of that weight is muscle. And as we know, muscle is protective. And the fat that they carry tends to sit subcutaneously under the skin rather than around their organs. So what that means is that their metabolic profile is often surprisingly healthy. Their insulin sensitivity is pretty good because their large muscle mass absorbs glucose efficiently. Their inflammatory markers could be low because visceral fat is not flooding their portal vein that goes towards the liver with inflammatory signals. The BMI says that they're obese, but their biology says otherwise. Now, if you flip that around, think of somebody who is pretty slim, they've got a normal or even a low BMI, but who has spent years eating a diet in refined carbs, barely exercising, sleeping pretty poorly, under significant chronic stress as well. And remember, stress and poor sleep specifically drive visceral fat accumulation. And here's why in simple terms. So when you're stressed or you're sleep deprived, your body releases a hormone called cortisol, which is your stress hormone. Now, cortisol's job back in the day, thousands and thousands of years ago, was to prepare you for a physical emergency. It raises your blood sugar to give your muscles fuel for fighting or for running away from something. And it directs fat storage specifically towards your visceral compartment, the deep abdominal area, because that fat is right next to the major blood vessels and it can be released into the bloodstream very rapidly if you need energy in a crisis. So the body essentially says, store the fuel where I can get to it the fastest. So when cortisol is chronically elevated from poor sleep or relentless work pressure, or from an always-on modern lifestyle, the body keeps directing your fat storage inwards. Rather than under your skin, it goes around your organs instead, regardless of whether you are eating a lot or eating a little, if that makes sense. This is why stressed, sleep-deprived people, think of doctors or nurses working night shifts or police officers. This is why these sort of people accumulate abdominal fat even when they don't feel like they're overeating. The hormones are making that decision, not the calories. So that slim person with poor lifestyle habits might carry their modest body fat almost entirely in the visceral compartment, wrapped around your liver and the intestines, and completely invisible from the outside. So their waist to height ratio might be borderline. Their metabolic profile, so their insulin levels and inflammatory markers and blood pressure, they might tell a very different story from their appearance. And this is sometimes called TOFI, T-O-F-I, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And it's more common than most people realize. And it's one of the reasons that relying on weight or appearance alone to judge cardiovascular health is pretty dangerous. So why is visceral fat so biologically dangerous, and why does so much of it go to the liver? So visceral fat, as we know, sits around your organs, but why does its location make it so much more damaging than the fat elsewhere? Well, the answer lies in your anatomy, and specifically in something called the portal vein. What is the portal vein and why does it matter? Well, the portal vein is the major blood vessel that collects blood draining from the intestines and the abdominal organs and carries it directly into the liver before it goes anywhere else in the body. And this is a deliberate anatomical design. So everything absorbed from the gut goes to the liver first. Everything, where it can be processed and filtered and regulated before entering into the general circulation that goes around the rest of your body. The liver is basically the gatekeeper. It is a really important organ. But the thing is, visceral fat sits right in the drainage territory of the portal vein. The anatomy is simply that the veins draining the abdominal fat depots empty directly into the portal system. So the fatty acids and the inflammatory signals and the hormones that visceral fat releases travel straight into the portal vein and then arrive at the liver in a really high concentration before the rest of the body has even seen these things. Subcutaneous fat, on the other hand, the stuff that you can see, releases its fatty acids into the general circulation where they are diluted across the whole body before reaching the liver. And that is a really important distinction. Basically, to summarize that point here, visceral fat has a direct line straight to the liver, and it floods that line continuously with signals that disrupt the liver's metabolic function in ways that subcutaneous fat, because it doesn't drain into the liver, can't replicate. But why does visceral fat release inflammatory molecules at all? Why does this happen? And this is a really important question because it sounds quite strange. Why would the body's own fat cause inflammation? The honest answer is that it's not supposed to, and it doesn't intend to. As we said, visceral fat is positioned around your organs, so what that means is that it's the most readily accessible fat store in the body. It can be mobilized really quickly when energy is really needed. So in our evolutionary past, when the body was under real physical stress, like famine or injury or an infection, visceral fat would release both fatty acids as an emergency fuel and inflammatory signals as part of the immune sort of alarm response, because danger typically meant injury or infection that needed to be fought off. So that inflammation was useful. It was a small sort of temporary, localized emergency response. The problem, though, is that in the modern world, the triggers for visceral fat accumulation, like poor diet and chronic stress and poor sleep and inactivity, these are never ending. Visceral fat that has grown large enough becomes stuck in this state of permanent low-grade alarm, releasing those inflammatory signals continuously, even though there is no genuine threat, if that makes sense. The emergency system is jammed in the on position indefinitely. So to recap this section, and I want to draw a historical contrast here that I think makes all of this really vivid. Our great-grandparents, and certainly our ancestors long before them, would have had almost no visceral fat in the quantities we see today. They ate whole foods that look like food, containing natural fiber that digested really slowly, producing modest and gradual rises in blood glucose, rather than the really sharp spikes from refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed food that we see today. They had long natural gaps between meals, not because they were fasting deliberately, but because food back then required effort and preparation, and it wasn't available on demand around the clock. They weren't snacking every couple of hours like we do today. So their insulin levels spent most of the day at or near baseline, and the body had regular extended windows to draw on fat as fuel. And also they moved throughout the day as well. The entire day was spent moving, not in a single gym session, but continuously. So they were walking or carrying things or building things and farming, which kept their muscles absorbing glucose efficiently after every single meal, and they maintained high insulin sensitivity throughout their entire life. So those three things together, whole food that digested really slowly, Natural intervals between eating where that insulin could come back down to normal and consistent daily movement meant that insulin resistance never really developed at the population level. They never really saw it back then. And without insulin resistance, the hormonal and metabolic environment that drives visceral fat accumulation was never created. This is why I say trying to live like your great-grandparents is a really good way of thinking about things. They had the great lifestyle and daily habits that meant that chronic diseases never really developed. But the downside is that they didn't have the modern medicine that can treat infections. And, we have surgery and safe anesthesia now. So really the best of both worlds would be combining the lifestyle of our great-grandparents and the modern medicine that we see today, the great lifestyle habits that prevent chronic disease, and the ability to operate and screen and give antibiotics and diagnose really quickly. Those two worlds together would be the best healthcare system, in my opinion. But anyway, I digress. Visceral fat at the scale that we now see today really is a disease of modern life. It is not a personal failure. It is a predictable metabolic consequence of the way that modern life is structured these days. And we have to address this. So let's talk about what visceral fat actually does in your body. How does it lead to heart disease and diabetes and dementia as well? So as we've talked about, visceral fat releases inflammatory signals and fatty acids into your liver continuously. But what does that mean for your health? Why does that chain of events lead to the things that kill us? And it's worth talking about inflammation a bit more closely. So what is inflammation and why is chronic inflammation so damaging? Well, inflammation is the body's alarm response. So when something is wrong, immune cells release chemical signals called cytokines that coordinate the body's defense. In the short term, that is completely essential. It's how you fight infections and heal wounds as well. But when those same inflammatory signals are being released constantly, day after day, 24/7, 365, from your visceral fat sitting around your organs, the body is in a permanent low-grade state of alarm. Now, that chronic inflammation damages the delicate inner lining of your blood vessels called the endothelium. It promotes the buildup of fatty plaques in your arteries, and it directly disrupts the way that cells handle insulin. All three of those consequences are major drivers of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and increasingly dementia as well. And that chronic inflammation damages the very delicate lining of your blood vessels called the endothelium. It promotes the buildup of fatty plaques in the arteries, and it directly disrupts the way that your cells handle insulin. And it's that last consequence, the disruption of insulin, that sits at the center of almost everything else visceral fat does to your body, and it's worth understanding properly. So insulin is the hormone that your pancreas releases after you eat, telling cells to open up and absorb glucose from the bloodstream. Now, when it works properly, blood glucose rises after a meal and then falls back down efficiently. Insulin resistance is when your cells stop responding properly to that signal, so the door gets stiff. The pancreas then has to release more and more insulin just to get the same result. And here is the vicious cycle that makes visceral fat so difficult to escape once it takes hold. So visceral fat causes insulin resistance, and insulin resistance causes more visceral fat. The fatty acids released by visceral fat into the portal vein directly interferes with the liver's ability to respond to insulin. And the inflammatory cytokines that we were just discussing jam the insulin signaling machinery inside cells throughout the entire body. So blood glucose and insulin levels stay elevated for longer and longer after every meal. And the thing is, chronically elevated insulin specifically promotes fat storage in the visceral compartment. The more visceral fat you have, the harder it becomes to lose, because the metabolic environment it creates actively drives further accumulation. So when we say that visceral fat is the first to go when you change your lifestyle, that is absolutely true. But the point is that the longer it continues and the more visceral fat you have, the harder it will get. But how does all of this connect to heart disease then? How does insulin and visceral fat connect with the biggest killer in the world, which is cardiovascular disease? Well, chronically elevated insulin and inflammation, those two things damage your endothelium, which is this single cell thick lining of every blood vessel in your body. A damaged endothelium stops producing something called nitric oxide, which normally keeps your blood vessels relaxed and open, and that keeps your blood pressure down. Plaques begin forming in the artery walls. As I said, your blood pressure rises, your coronary arteries narrow progressively, and then eventually one of those plaques will rupture. It will form a clot because it will be bleeding behind that plaque, so a clot will form, and that's what causes a heart attack if that happens in your coronary artery. But what about dementia then? How does insulin connect with dementia? Well, the brain has its own version of insulin resistance, and the same metabolic dysfunction that drives cardiovascular disease also disrupts glucose metabolism in the brain tissue. It promotes neuroinflammation, and it appears to accelerate the accumulation of toxic proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease. Remember that the brain is one of the most metabolically demanding organs in the body. It consumes around 20% of the body's total energy, despite only being around 2% of the total weight. And it depends on a very reliable and well-regulated supply of glucose to function. So when insulin resistance disrupts that supply, the brain cells begin to struggle for fuel. Some researchers have actually gone as far as describing Alzheimer's disease as a form of brain-specific insulin resistance, sometimes calling it type 3 diabetes. What we know is that chronically elevated inflammation, poor glucose regulation, and visceral fat accumulation all consistently show up as risk factors for cognitive decline in these really big, large population studies, and that the same lifestyle changes that reduce visceral fat and improve your insulin response also appear to reduce your risk of dementia. So the brain and the heart, it turns out, are threatened by the same underlying process. So what are the things that actually drive the accumulation of visceral fat, and why are some people so much more vulnerable than others? Well, the single biggest dietary driver is excess refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed food. So refined carbohydrates, things like white bread or sugary drinks or processed snacks, refined cereals, breakfast cereals like Cocoa Pops or Cheerios, something like that, all of these cause really sharp spikes in your blood glucose, which trigger an equally large insulin response. Now, if that happens all day, every day, for every meal and for your snacks as well, then that turns into chronically elevated blood sugar and chronically elevated insulin. And that tells the body to store fat, because insulin is essentially a storage hormone. And it tells the body specifically to store it viscerally. Your viscera are your organs. The visceral cavity is your abdominal cavity. So reducing refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed food will eventually lower your insulin levels, it will stabilize your blood sugar, and it will remove the primary hormonal driver of visceral fat accumulation. But what about sleep? Why does poor sleep specifically raise your cortisol, and then how does that cause visceral fat? Well, when you don't sleep properly, your brain detects this as a state of stress and threat. And I touched on this earlier in the video. Now, your brain cannot distinguish between the stress of a genuinely dangerous situation like an armed robber or a saber-toothed tiger, and then the stress of chronic sleep deprivation. It responds to both the same way by activating the adrenal glands on top of your kidneys to release cortisol. Now, cortisol is the body's emergency fuel mobilizer. It raises your blood glucose by telling the liver to release stored glucose, and it tells the body to store fat in the visceral compartment where it can be accessed quickly in an emergency. And the thing is, even a few nights of poor sleep, like a shift worker would have, measurably worsens your cortisol. It worsens your insulin sensitivity, and it also increases something called ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. And what that does is specifically drives your appetite towards high calorie, high carbohydrate foods. And I can tell you this firsthand, that this is absolutely real. When I'd be driving home after a night shift, I would be stopping at the petrol station, craving things like donuts and cakes and crisps. These are foods that I wouldn't normally eat when I was well rested, but when I was sleep deprived and my body was in this high stress state, this is what my brain wanted. And it happens because your hormones have genuinely changed. The body thinks it is in danger and it responds accordingly. But what about chronic stress more broadly then, even with adequate sleep? Well, exactly the same mechanism applies. So chronic psychological stress, whether that is from work or your relationship or financial pressures or even social isolation, it maintains your cortisol at elevated levels throughout the day compared to somebody who isn't stressed. And social isolation is really worth mentioning specifically here because the research on loneliness and your metabolic health is really, really striking. And this always gets a bit of pushback, but we can't argue with what the evidence shows. So loneliness and social isolation activate the same biological stress pathways as physical danger. They raise your cortisol levels, they increase inflammatory markers, they worsen your sleep quality as well, they promote visceral fat accumulation. And this is thought to be an evolutionary response. Being isolated from your group was a life-threatening situation for our ancestors. So the body responds to social isolation as a survival threat. Now, this doesn't mean if you live alone, then you are socially isolated. It means how you feel. Do you feel connected? Do you feel like you have somebody that cares for you and is thinking about you? Do you have something to care for, like a family member or a dog? We're talking about people who are isolated most of the time and feel lonely as well. That is the distinction. In the modern world, people who are isolated or lonely or lacking strong social connection consistently show worse metabolic profiles than those with strong social ties or those that don't feel lonely. And visceral fat accumulation is part of that picture. But what about muscle? What is the link between muscle and insulin and visceral fat? So skeletal muscle is the body's primary site of glucose disposal. So when you eat, your muscles absorb a large proportion of the glucose that enters the bloodstream, which keeps your blood glucose and insulin levels under control. Now, people with a low muscle mass have less capacity to absorb glucose, which means blood sugar stays elevated for longer after meals if they have the same amount of carbohydrates. Insulin also has to work harder, and the metabolic environment driving visceral fat storage is more persistently present. And this is one of the reasons why visceral fat accumulation accelerates with age, because muscle mass naturally declines from your mid-30s onwards in the absence of resistance training. And as that buffer shrinks and goes down, glucose disposal becomes less efficient and visceral fat tends to fill that metabolic gap, because we know that any glucose that isn't used or can be stored as glycogen is stored as fat. So how do you actually reduce visceral fat? What are the things that we recommend, and how does each one work? What is actually happening in the body? Well, aerobic exercise is probably the most consistently effective single intervention for visceral fat in the research. But why? What actually happens physiologically? Well, when you do sustained aerobic activity, whether that is brisk walking or jogging or cycling or swimming, several things happen simultaneously inside your body. The first thing is that your muscles are demanding really large amounts of fuel to keep working. So they pull glucose out of the bloodstream really rapidly, which drops your blood glucose and insulin levels. The second thing is a molecule called AMPK. Think of this as your body's fuel gauge sensor. It activates inside your muscle cells and tells them to increase the number of glucose transporters on their surface, making them more efficient at absorbing glucose even hours after that exercise is over. This is what we mean by improved insulin sensitivity. The cells have become more responsive to insulin and more capable of clearing out sugar without needing as much insulin. The third thing is that aerobic exercise specifically activates fat burning in the abdominal region, the visceral region. So a meta-analysis published in Obesity Reviews found that aerobic exercise significantly reduced visceral fat even without dietary changes and even when total body weight barely shifted, because the mechanism is hormonal and metabolic, not simply about burning calories. But what about resistance training? Does resistance training help with visceral fat? Well, yes, absolutely. Obviously it does. Lifting weights and body weight exercises, these build and preserve your muscle mass. More muscle means more capacity to absorb glucose from the bloodstream efficiently after every meal, which means lower insulin levels throughout the day. Now, think of muscle like a metabolic sponge. The bigger and more active that sponge is, the more glucose it can absorb and the less work the pancreas has to do to produce insulin and manage that sugar. So if your muscles can manage that sugar, then it takes that job away from the pancreas. Preserving muscle also maintains a good metabolic rate as we age as well, which matters enormously from your mid-30s onwards as muscle naturally declines with age. The most effective approach for visceral fat and insulin is combining both aerobic exercise for direct visceral fat reduction and improved insulin sensitivity, and also resistance training to preserve that metabolic infrastructure that keeps visceral fat accumulation in check over the long term. But what about diet? How do you adjust your diet to help with visceral fat? What does it actually do physiologically? So let's recap here. So when you eat refined carbohydrates, which most of us do, most of us get around the average person gets 2/3 of their calories from ultra-processed foods in the Western world. So when you eat these refined carbohydrates, whether that's white bread or sugary drinks or processed snacks, they digest really rapidly because the fiber has been removed. That's basically what ultra-processing does. It removes the fiber to make them more shelf-stable, make them more easy to eat, less chewing involved, which means they digest really rapidly. Glucose then floods into the bloodstream really quickly, your blood sugar spikes really sharply, and then the pancreas has to release a large amount of insulin to deal with it. Now, that repeated insulin surge is the primary hormonal driver of visceral fat storage. This is what we talked about in this video. So when you replace those foods with whole foods containing fiber, the fiber slows digestion, glucose enters the bloodstream really gradually, blood glucose rises quite modestly rather than sharply, and the insulin response is much smaller. The hormonal environment here shifts away from fat storage and towards fat burning. Prioritizing protein adds another layer onto that. So protein is the most satisfying macronutrient, meaning it keeps you fuller for longer and it preserves muscle during weight loss, which is one of the biggest side effects of losing weight. It's what we see in people who take Mounjaro or Ozempic. They lose massive amounts of weight, but because their appetite goes down and they're eating so much less compared to what they usually would, they're not getting the protein. So they also lose muscle, that protective muscle, and that is detrimental to their long-term health. I mean, clearly, what's better, being super obese or being a normal weight, inverted commas, with low muscle mass? Big question there, but you want to prioritize your muscle when you're losing weight. So you have to increase your protein intake. And for most people, we're talking about 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight of protein per day spread across your meals. Really, the biggest thing for your diet is trying to almost completely cut out ultra-processed foods, eat only whole foods that your great-grandparents would recognize as food, nothing in a packet, cook from scratch as often as you can, have a breakfast where you prepare it, you sit down and eat it rather than just having a croissant or a bowl of cereal or something on the way to work. and prioritizing protein as well. But what about time-restricted eating, which is a type of intermittent fasting? What's actually happening here? Well, when you eat within a defined window of 8 to 12 hours and you fast for the remainder of that day, so you fast for 12 or 14 hours, you are extending the period during which blood glucose is low and insulin is at baseline, and the body has no choice but to draw on stored fat for fuel. Remember that the fuel priority order is the body uses glucose from food first, then glycogen from the liver and the muscles, and then once those are depleted, it starts breaking down fat stores. Now, it varies from person to person, and all of these processes sort of overlap. There's not a defined, hour where you stop burning glucose and then you start with glycogen and then you start burning fat. Generally, what the literature says is that after around 12 hours of not eating, you would have sort of burned through a lot of your glycogen stores. So then you start burning through more of your fat stores. So the longer the fasting window, the more time the body spends in that fat burning state. So for visceral fat specifically, which is the most metabolically accessible fat store, this extended fat burning window appears to preferentially mobilize the visceral fat. This isn't magic and it doesn't work for everybody. Some people find long fasting windows really difficult to sustain. Depends on, possibly your gender, your medical history, the time of the month for some people as well. So it won't work for everybody, but it's something that we recommend to try for at least a couple of weeks to see how you feel. Because for those who find it quite natural and sustainable, it is a really, really good physiological tool. And what I do personally is, compared to what I used to do, I just bring my evening meal forward a bit, sort of the latest at 6 o'clock in the evening, and then try and eat my breakfast at the earliest 8 o'clock. So that's a 14-hour window overnight where you're not eating, where your insulin levels can come down and your body can start burning glycogen and hopefully a bit of visceral fat as well. And the thing is, as I've said many times before, the visceral fat, because it's so metabolically active, it responds really quickly when the signals driving its accumulation are removed. The same high metabolic activity that makes it so damaging also makes it highly responsive to change. So people who improve their sleep and exercise every day, reduce their processed carbohydrate intake, and they try to manage their stress levels and also have an extended fasting window of at least 14 hours, which I get if you're a regular worker or if you're a parent or whatever, that's not achievable for everybody. But if you try to improve as many things as you can, people often see abdominal changes before they see changes elsewhere, because visceral fat, being the most readily mobilized emergency fuel store, is the first thing the body draws on when the hormonal environment stops telling it to accumulate more. So let's bring all of this together then. So visceral fat is not just excess weight. It is a biologically active tissue that is packed really tightly around all of your organs in your abdominal cavity with a direct line, a big direct vein called your portal vein to your liver. It releases inflammatory signals and fatty acids continuously. It can cause insulin resistance. It damages your blood vessel walls. It drives fatty liver disease. It raises your blood pressure. And it sets the stage very easily for heart disease and type 2 diabetes and also dementia and some cancers as well, often decades before any obvious symptoms. And what makes it really difficult is that people often ask us, well, how do I know if I carry visceral fat? Well, it's really difficult. If you've got a big beer belly, then obviously the chances are you are carrying some visceral fat, but it gets harder to detect in people who look slim and are a normal weight. And that's why the advice at the beginning of the video is so important. The vicious cycle between visceral fat and insulin resistance means that the problem compounds itself very silently over years. And things like poor sleep, and chronic stress and loneliness as well, and alcohol, refined carbohydrates, low muscle mass, and the hormonal shifts of aging and menopause all accelerate the problem. But aerobic exercise and resistance training and better sleep and less ultra-processed foods and managing your stress and natural fasting intervals, and I'm not recommending any wacky fasting regime, although that might work for some people, just try simply a 14-hour fast overnight. All of these directly interrupt the visceral fat cycle, and visceral fat responds to those changes faster than most people expect. And just remember that your waist to height ratio is super, super important. If you've never measured this on yourself, then just get a really flexible tape measure that you can buy for £1 from the post office or from Amazon. Just try it and see where your number is. A ratio below 0.5 is the target, and it works for all body types. Now, combined with an honest assessment of your sleep and your movement and your diet and your stress levels, it gives you a very real picture of what is likely happening around your organs, far more useful than a number on your scale or your BMI. Remember that your body keeps score quietly. It remembers all of the decisions that you make in terms of your diet and your lifestyle. But your body also recovers faster than most people realize when you give it what it needs. So you need to change the inputs every single day. So that's a bit longer than my normal video. I really hope you found it useful. There is so much to cover when it comes to visceral fat and insulin resistance. And I'm going to do a few more videos in the near future that are more like a lecture, like this sort of style. So let me know if you found them useful. I'm sure some of you will prefer the shorter video, so I'll try and do a mix over the coming weeks. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you found useful, what you didn't find useful, and I'll try my best to take all of those comments into consideration in the next video. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.